we're going to explore John chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. And these are very well-known verses. And as you can see behind me, this is what it would have looked like within ancient Israel, where the shepherd would have walked in front of the sheep and would have called them by name and drawn them out into the pasture, wherever the pasture was. And so this is a very important passage, and it's an important passage because it sets up a lot of John's perspective of what Jesus was like. So let's have a look at the passage, and you can read it either with me or read it by yourselves. Let's have a look at John chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. It says this: "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." What I'd like you to do is to spend a bit of time thinking about that, maybe reflecting on that passage again, maybe even reading it again. And what I'd like you to do is to spend just a few moments thinking about the images within this particular story. Now, as you do that, there's a couple of things that I'd like you to remember. Number one, notice who Jesus is actually saying this to. He's not talking to the disciples. He's not talking even to the crowd. He's talking to the Pharisees. Now, within John's gospel, the Pharisees are essentially religious leaders. So even though they might not have been that within the time of Jesus itself, the way in which John uses them is that they're the leaders of the people. They're the ministers, essentially, of the people. In that case, how does this passage connect to the concepts of what he's talking about, if he's talking to those leaders rather than to the people themselves? The second thing I'd like you to think about is where Jesus says, "I am the gate." Now, that's interesting. What's the image of a gate mean to you? What is the image of what a gate does? What does that conjure up for you? So that's the second thing. The third thing that I'd like you to think about is that concept of hearing the voice of the shepherd. So knowing his voice. What does that mean for you? So what I'd like you to do now is to just spend a bit of time discussing amongst yourselves some of your reflection on this passage, what your first reaction, so maybe even your feelings about the passage. Spend a bit of time and do that. Welcome back. What I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about the environment in which this is taking place. So let's first look at the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a connection with the word means those who are separate. And separate from what? Well, what we actually come to believe now is that the Pharisees most probably were separate from the Sadducees and the other leaders, in the sense that they were following a slightly different form of Judaism. They were following a form of Judaism focused around the synagogue and the Torah, the actual first 5 books of the Bible, more than around the concepts of sacrifice and the temple. Now, essentially what that means is that the Pharisees are a little bit more like Jesus. He was speaking against the temple. He was speaking against sacrifice. And so in some ways, he's speaking to his own group of leaders and speaking into their particular life. So that's part of the context that's within this as well. Understanding the I am sayings is actually quite important for the whole of John, because what it does is it actually tells us what John was writing his gospel for. Now, we need to remember that John isn't really like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew was one of the disciples. Mark and Luke were actually one of the disciples of the original apostles. And so they didn't actually meet with Jesus themselves. John, of course, meets with Jesus, but he then goes to Ephesus and then gets exiled to the island of Patmos. Now, getting exiled into that island was most probably the best thing that could happen for us as recipients of his writings, because he built around him a school of thought, which we now call the Johannine literature. And that includes the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, and of course his three letters, or the three Johannine epistles, as they're called, or Johannine letters. And what we need to see is that it's almost as if he had time on that island to think through, what does it mean to be a Christian? And how do we grow as Christians in the midst of that process? And so when you think of the gospel, you need to realize that the reason why he writes it is not so much like Luke does to give an ordered account, or like Mark does, which to give inspiration and enthusiasm and practical application of the gospel for the people in Rome. Or even, for example, Matthew, who is writing to Jews particularly, and Jews in Israel. That's not what John's doing. John is writing essentially to the church, and he wants to tell them, this is what you need to help you to grow in faith. Essentially, that word to grow in faith and life and witness could be the word discipleship. And essentially, that's what John's on about. He's on about discipleship. Now, he uses lots of different methodologies to do that, including there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of symbology, there's even some stories that we see in none of the other Gospels. But the one particular thing that he uses are the 7 I am sayings. Now, each of those I am sayings have often been seen as different aspects of Jesus' character. But I disagree with that. I don't think that the I am sayings are so much about Jesus's character as much as they are about what we would say, the process of discipleship. Kind of that discipleship needs to start somewhere and then go through this process. And he uses the 7 I am sayings as the 7 concepts, or the 7, what I want to call the 7 links in a chain of discipleship. So it's that 7 links of the chain of discipleship that I want to talk about just quickly as we start this first session. So the first link in the chain is that Jesus is the bread of life. For any discipleship to happen, what we need to do is to start with what we put in order to actually be able to work for God, in order to be able to grow in God, in order to be able to connect with God. It's all about what we take in first. Where do we get our sustenance from? And of course, the first link in the chain of discipleship is, where do we get our sustenance from? From Jesus, who is the bread of life. And so as the bread of life, now remember that image of bread is often connected to the Torah, to the first 5 books of the Bible, to the law. But remember that the law is not just a collection of commands. The law is rather the boundaries within which God allows us to live and to breathe and to move. The law is essentially that instruction which helps us to grow in him. Now, of course, Jesus is referred to then as the bread of life. He's the one that we can eat, that we can find our sustenance from. He's the one that can energize the process of becoming disciples. The second link is the light of the world. And so once we've received, well, obviously the next step is to give, is to show forth that which we've received. And the light of the world is essentially where Jesus is the one who shows forth light to the world. And light is always used as that symbol of something which identifies things in the darkness, of opening up vistas, of giving us a sense of what the future might be, of giving us hope and peace and those connections. And all of those images are there within Jesus as the light of the world. But also it's the second link in the chain of discipleship, in that as we've received the bread, so then we show forth the light. The third image of the I am sayings, of course, is the one that we did in this passage, which is, I am the gate. or the door. I think the gate is better in the sense of the sheepfold. But remember what I was saying earlier about the sheepfold, is that a gate not only allows you into the sheepfold, which is a place of security and safety, but it also is the gate that enters out into the world, to the pasture, to the place where we're meant to go. So now we've received the gift of God's presence in the bread. We're showing forth that in the light, and now we go out into the world to go and to share that light with the world. And so what we'll see is that as we build this chain, we'll see that as we go through the Gospel of John, that this chain, these links link together and show us how we move towards becoming disciples. One last thing that we need to talk about is the concept of symbology, of the symbols that Jesus uses and that John would then show forth in his gospel. One of the things that we see with John's gospel is that it's a highly symbolic gospel, whereas Mark's gospel is all about action. In many ways, John's gospel is got symbols, and it's those symbols that we need to interpret. The problem with symbols and interpreting symbols correctly is that it's quite hard to do, because we need to understand what is the symbol actually referring to. Now, in this particular case, we've got a number of symbols. We've got the symbol of the sheep, we've got the symbol of the shepherd, we've got then the symbols of the sheepfold. Of course, we've got the gate itself. We've even got some others in terms of who the thief and the robber is. What I'd like you to do is to take those three concepts, the three concepts of the Pharisees, the gate, and then the thief and the robber, and see what does that mean for you? What do those symbols mean for you? How do they interpret themselves and connect themselves with you? Welcome back. We want to finish this by now saying, okay, so we've understood then the concept of the gate. We've understood about the concept of a gate which swings both in and out. And that in fact, where we see in the linkages of the I am sayings, it's the out that really matters in this situation. Yes, it does say that in fact the sheep will come into the sheepfold, but notice that it doesn't just come into the sheepfold, but actually also allow the sheep to leave the sheepfold, to go and find pasture. And that's really the focus of the story, is that what the Pharisees were doing was really getting people to not go out. They were holding on to the people. They were constricting them. They were stopping them from having the concept of life, and life to the full. In some translations, it's life abundantly. Now, of course, we need to remember that that word life comes from the Greek word zoe, which isn't about a length of time, but really an abundant life. It means a life filled with a sense of purpose and mission and value. What I'd like you to do as a final time of discussion on this passage is to talk about how we can live this passage out. What does it mean for us to actually live out the passage of Jesus being the gate? What does it mean for us to go into the pasture? What is the pasture that we're talking about? And finally, particularly to think, what does it mean to have life, and life in all its fullness? In this particular time, in this particular age, in this particular situation, after COVID, after the situation we find ourselves in with the problems we're seeing around in our world, how do we connect with the concepts of this? How do we understand what it does mean to have life, and life in all its fullness? I'd like you to discuss that. I'd like you to discuss the ways in which we can experience this, the ways in which we can share this, the ways in which we can connect with it, so that Jesus may be for us the gate that leads us not only into the sheepfold, into the place of safety, but particularly leads us out of the sheepfold and into the pasture. In fact, without the pasture, we wouldn't be able to do the things that God's called us to be as sheep.